So, okay, everybody, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Lev Manovich. For those of you who don't know him, you should know him. Yeah, Lev Manovich is one of the leading theorists of digital culture worldwide and a pioneer in the use of data science for analysis of visual culture. Yeah, Manovich is the author and editor of 15 books, including Cultural Analytics, AI Aesthetics, Theories of Software Culture, Instagram and Contemporary Image, Software Takes Command, a fantastic book that I really can recommend a lot, Soft Cinema, Navigating the Database, and The Language of New Media, which was described as the most suggestive and broad-ranging media history since Marshall McLuhan. He was included in the list of 25 people shaping the future of design in 2013, and the list of 50 most interesting people building the future in 2014. Manovich is a presidential professor at the Graduate Center CUNY and the director of the Cultural Analytics Lab. The lab created projects for the Museum of Modern Art, at New York Public Library, Google, and other clients. Manovich's latest book, Cultural Analytics, was published with the MIT Press in fall 2020, and I'm very, very happy to have you here, Lev. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sorry, I'm like in the dark. It's just, we're staying in this amazing, design hotel on the beach built by art student graduate, but it's not quite designed for Zoom at 10 p.m. where I'm in Korea. So, okay, so maybe it's not Lev, maybe it's a composer, but we'll find out.
Okay. Lev, I don't know if you have followed a little bit the things that I've been doing with the lab, and basically just to explain it shortly to you, we're doing a workshop here at Digital Futures, which is about the creation of data sets and how they influence architecture design, because of a very pressing problem, which is that if you want to do really architecture design, the data sets are not there yet to do that. They're designed for other things, but they're not designed to do architecture. And among the things that we're discussing in this workshop is, of course, the impact of artificial intelligence to cultural production. And as you are like the main protagonist in thinking and writing about these ideas, I thought it would be great to have you to discuss maybe some of the aspects of AI and culture, about generative AI and how it comes into the design environment. And of course, most importantly, the big question that everyone is asking about aspects of creativity and AI. Yeah.
Oh, sure. You want me to start?
I was just thinking, do I have a question for you, or do I let you talk and we'll figure out?
You can let me say a few things, provocative things, but you just tell me for how long. Because I'm I sort of gave this talk for Neil panel 2 weeks ago, and the talk was about AI in myths of creativity. And at that point, I counted 6 myths. Now I already counted 12 myths. So I'm actually writing a book. So you just tell me the limits, because I can go on for a while. But specifically, I will talk about data sets. So how many minutes you want to give me for some provocations or opening remarks?
I think opening remarks, how about 10 minutes?
Oh, it's more than enough, yeah. Okay, so, being sometimes a media historian, I like to start in the past. Right? So I want to remind, our listeners, all 26 of them, and people who will be watching it later, but of course, AI and creativity in art doesn't start today. It doesn't start in 2013 when there's a little revolution and people realize that for certain very narrow tasks, supervised machine learning using neural nets is outperforming other methods. So just to remind you, because not everybody knows this history. So AI as a field was defined in 1956. For the first 15 years, Russia and America were developing in parallel. Sometimes Russia would be ahead, sometimes America was ahead. So the field was also started developing the same time in Russia. And the original idea of AI was, can we take a digital computer and have it simulate, or to give it equivalence of human cognitive functions. right? So by cognitive functions, which is something we studied in cognitive science, it's my ability to kind of see things and to interpret things in the environment, such as recognizing scenes, recognizing objects, recognizing, right, kind of detecting where these objects are, detecting movements, translating, understanding language, written and spoken, translating from one language to another, be able to deal, right, and use lots of information and memory, be able to make a plan, and so on. Right. So notice that with the original idea of AI, there was nothing about arts or creativity. Okay? So and AI, as you know, went through different stages. The neural networks, the basic idea of neural networks was first introduced in 1958 by a PhD student of a Russian biologist who migrated to America, right? With like Russian traces all here. The first kind of theoretical analysis of networks was done by two mathematicians in Ukraine, Kiev, in the 60s. And this is all like in Wikipedia, but people normally haven't connected the dots, right? So as I said, right, so here's a question, right? AI, as it originally was defined, and it's still understood today, it's about simulating kind of human cognitive functions. So what does it have to do with arts and creativity? So I think when we're born, right, we can all understand like, things in our visual environment. I mean, as long as we're like 5 months old. And then we learn to use language and so on. So, by 5 years old or 7 years old, all normal human children acquire these abilities. But only some of us later learn to sing, to draw, to do 3D design, right, to work in Photoshop and so on. Right? So this is already a very interesting kind of, right, conceptual question. What exactly are we going to simulate if we now want to simulate a creative human being, right? Maybe first, right? So I would say that in order for us to draw, in order for us to design, in order for us to maybe build a model, in order for us to, edit a photograph, sing or make music, perhaps the human being, right, already needs to have basic cognitive capacities, right? Vision, memory, language, spatial cognition, and so on. Right. So one potential kind of direction, if we continue this for a second, since we don't know, right, how to give computer yet with abilities, yes, the computer can translate, sometimes very well, sometimes not. Only recently it became kind of more practical. Yes, computer can see things in images. We have to give it like millions and millions of images to train it, and we have to painstakingly train it. So now it maybe recognize like 10,000 objects, but not all of it, right? So a computer is not on the level of a 3 or 5 year old yet. So how can we possibly dream about making creative AI, right? We can make creative AI, but it will not have anything to do with human creativity, right? Because I think human artistic or spatial, right, or design creativity, I think happens, right? Yes, children also make drawings, but what they recognize is adult creativity, I think happens after humans already acquire, right, all these capacities. So that's, I think, very interesting kind of question, right? Can we actually hope to do anything meaningful with so-called creative AI, since our computers don't have basic cognitive capacities, right? So then the second thing I want to say, maybe just one more thing, right? So this is a bit of a historical. So to remind people that word artist and the word creativity have only become popular about 200 years ago in Europe during the Romantic period, right? So ancient Greeks had no idea about art or artists. For them, the people kind of, basically the people who had skills, all kinds of skills, including drawing, making pottery, making sculpture. And the word we used was techne, for technique, right, or technology. And we can call this like a craftsperson, a technician, right? I mean, technicians are basically original artists. Even in the Renaissance, people started to think a little about individuality, right? But the artist was still a kind of craftsperson. So only, I would say, in the late 18th and early 19th century, the contemporary idea that there is artists, that art is the exclusive domain of creativity, right? Before the concept was separate, right? Before 200 years ago, nobody connected art and creativity because art was something, first of all, not artists, we're craftspeople. Secondly, we followed rules, right? You learn in the academy how to make, proper painting, how to make proper architecture. This idea of creativity was completely absent from human culture up until 200 years ago. So if we continue this line, like what follows is, I think, pretty radical ideas. First of all, that the humans were able to do amazing creative things without ever having concepts of art and creativity. Therefore, these concepts are probably wrong, right? We are not any better than ancient Greeks or people in Middle Ages or people 1,000 years ago in Islamic civilization, Asia, and these people did very well. In fact, we had better art, right? We had more creativity in art without ever having these concepts. So probably when we're talking endlessly, right, about AI and art and creativity, we're completely wasting our time, right? We should be we probably should be doing something else because we humans, don't really need this to make things we recognize as art, design, architecture, and so on. So I think I'll stop here. I mean, I have many more things I can say, right? I also want to say some things, very specific things about tools. Both design tools, etc. But I think that's enough, right, to get started. I hope it was enough for us to kind of enough meat for us to cook. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lev. That was really great. Also, thank you for the walk down the memory lane of the arts, actually where it comes from. I think this was super insightful. And the other aspect that I thought was really interesting in your provocation was the aspect of the cognitive capacities, where you're basically saying you need to have cognitive capacities to be creative after all.
Well, right? Maybe not. I wouldn't say let's not say be creative, because I think to make things be recognized, art and design is one thing. Being creative is something else, right? As I said, it's a very recent idea that art is where creativity happens, right? So I think we kind of have to be a bit smarter than that and separate it. So my question was, where creativity can look, a child can be creative figuring out, how to tie his shoes, right? That's also creative. But I'm saying if you want kind of AI which will assist us or make for us art, design, cinema, perhaps we have to give it first cognitive capacities, right? So I just kind of want to, sorry for being like a jumping, but I just think if we can separate the idea of art, design, and creativity, maybe it's more constructive from my point of view. Sorry.
I do completely agree with that, because if you just think about examples, I mean, Beethoven was deaf and could do fantastic music, although he didn't hear it. So the cognitive capacity to hear it was not necessary in this case. Or a blind person can be profoundly musically, for example. Yeah. So the idea of cognitive, I mean, I understand that cognitive capacities are necessary to absorb art. Right? I mean, you need to see the art if you want to, or you need to hear the piece of music, right? But for the process of making it, occasionally it's not even necessary. Yeah.
You think so? Do you have a proof that it's not necessary? I mean, I think yes, Beethoven went deaf, but before he was hearing, right? So.
Yes, but
I like your idea, but basically maybe me no you can right now prove it, but I think it's a fruitful conversation to try to accept both. Like to try to set both positions and can see where it goes, right?
Yeah, and about I mean, AIs do have fairly said limited, but they have cognitive capacities now. I mean, machine vision has proven that.
In the last 5 years, the last 6 years, we made very big progress.
Yeah.
Of course, you need to have like millions of CPUs, right? And a huge train. But it's like, it takes so much energy to train AI to do what a child can learn naturally. But it's a progress for sure.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, occasionally machines exceed our cognitive capacities. I mean, the abilities of neural networks to crunch through enormous amounts of data no human could do in his whole lifetime. Yeah, so there is but this is something machines always were better than us when it's speed and mass. Like those are things that machines can really do well. Humans are not so good in that, but they're better in others. I still think, for example, that one of the major things that happen in our brain when we misread things and through this misreading create something new and interesting, those things are not yet present in neural networks, for example. They don't understand that a mistake can be an advantage, for example, which humans can.
Yeah. Well, so I want to give you like one example of how computers are able to do amazing things. So I think what we have sometimes is not kind of like AI, which is like artificial intelligence, but we have like super AI. So think about search engine, right? Like Google. Okay, now it's using neural networks. 10 years ago, it wasn't. It actually doesn't matter, right? Usually, right? But it's already a kind of meta AI because it can index, right, billions of pages. I mean, I'm looking for something. It can calculate things on its index, and within a fraction of a second, it can find the right pages. There's no amount of humans. I mean, maybe if you put maybe humans to do it, but we still not able to do it, right? So as you said, computers kind of, maybe not at the beginning, right? The computer was calculating things like 100 times a second. Maybe you remember this beautiful movie about Turing, right? How like the human computers and the computer competing. But let's say by 1948, the computer was already ahead. So the computer was already doing something which is kind of like, right? So while the computers were not able to see things in one image, we can compute things beyond any human, like kind of superhuman intelligence.
Let me ask you something in your role as cultural theorist. Tools have changed the arts throughout history. I mean, every time something new comes up, the direction of art changes. I mean, I'm just going to mention two examples from the 19th century that changed art dramatically. The one is the invention of photography, and the other one being the invention of the oil paint in tubes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, basically, modern art only happened because of paint tubes. I mean, I think we don't completely realize how dramatic it was, but it is. And then, of course, modern architecture only happened because of reinforced concrete, right? Without reinforced concrete, we'll be still living in this like buildings of columns and tiny windows.
And windows.
Right?
Which might be even better for the environment.
So reinforced concrete was like new media of 1920s. You know?
Yeah. So in that aspect, how do you see? And I know this is a big question, and I'm not expecting like the definitive answer. But how do you think is AI changing architecture?
Yeah.
Or culture at large, maybe.
But yeah. Well, so I think because of career, right? So this wonderful panels, right? Dozens of panels. Maybe it's 10 a.m. for me, which is a bit early, or 11 p.m. So maybe I'll find the courage later to watch them, because I think that there are lots of architects, architectural students, architectural studios, which are using both traditional algorithms and machine learning in very interesting ways. But I like to be like a bit of a realist, maybe because I was brought up, right, in dialectical materialism in Russia, right? It was the only philosophy which was allowed, even though, of course, I rejected it already at 10 years old. Maybe this materialism remains to me, right? So it seems to me that what is really controlling or what is affecting architecture is the social conditions, right? So 20th century architecture, basically the biggest change humanity went to is scale. Okay? In 1900, it was about 1 billion people on this planet. By 2000, it's 6.5 billion. And I think architecture, right, people were doing great architecture. When you have tiny cities like St. Petersburg of 1850 with 300,000 people, suddenly you have to house these billions of people. And I think modern architecture completely failed. Right? So 99% of the people who live in Brazil, in Russia, everywhere, right? Basically, we live in ugly, decaying, with ugly concrete buildings. So if you ask me, right, like from a moral point of view, we shouldn't be even talking about AI, right? We should do something to make your life just a tiny bit better, right? Because even if we can design some beautiful AI buildings for rich people, billions of people continue living in this basically kind of concrete nightmare. Okay, but having said it, I just had to get this out of my system because I travel a lot, and even in a place like Korea, we can building these buildings which are like this 20-story right buildings which are all the same all over the country. We already obsolete. So can we use? So maybe we think can we use AI to convince our clients, right? To convince city mayors, to convince real estate companies, somehow trick them, right, into allowing us to do something more interesting, more humane. I think that'll be the best use of AI. We don't even have to say, we can just lie to them, right? So sorry, I kind of moved discussion to maybe like a very different point, but I think we kind of have to, especially today with global warming, right? I mean, architects have to think about right? And I'm sure you and many people here have to think about this reality, so maybe we can also say, okay, so now we have global warming, right? So the companies which have money like Microsoft or Google, they're having top architects designing new campuses, which are basically gardens, right? So architecture becomes invisible. So now we have this maybe new configuration, right? Architecture, nature, and AI. So maybe how this configuration can work together, right? But I think we have to think about it, because I think if we want to ask by itself how AI is going to change architecture, I think that was a meaningful question in 1995 or maybe in 2002. But today, I think, right, we have to think about other things. That's kind of my kind of just provocation.
Well, I do agree. I also consider myself rather a realist than an idealist. So I'm not going to do like architectural idealism like in the 20th century, which was very romantic in a way to think about like that. But I have another point on that, because you can use neural networks, and it's the same in the, no, it's not the same in the arts. Actually, I apologize to try to do that comparison. But in architecture, you can use it in two ways, right? You can use neural networks analytically, which would, for example, allow us to improve the living conditions of a lot of people by understanding first their living conditions, and second, how to do better architecture for that living condition. And the second one, which is one of the things you mentioned interests you, you can use neural networks in architecture generatively. So they actually they help in the design process. They help in creating things that we as humans probably wouldn't come up with. Yeah. And I think that's one of the most helpful and interesting parts for me, is the combination between these two abilities, that it can be analytical, but it can also be generative. And that is all in one package of code. Yeah. And it gives us the opportunity. I mean, we architects have already dabbled in analyzing big data by building information modeling for the last 15, 20 years. But we're now entering a completely different arena where we can actually harness and analyze far larger sets of data to hopefully do better architecture. And that's the only idealist part in me. It's like, maybe we can do better architecture.
Absolutely. So I think you're very right. And, I myself, right, for about 14 years, I was kind of focusing more on analytical capacities of data science. So I don't use the word AI, I use the word data science, which is like bigger because it's also about data. And that was a thing I called cultural analytics, right? So the idea was that computers are very good in computing and extracting or quantifying various features or characteristics of paintings, sculptures, buildings, as long as you represent them into 2D or 3D films. And this can allow us, right, to understand kind of patterns of human creativity, right? Like, for example, potentially you can say, okay, we can have like a model of every 20th century building and kind of figure out what actually people build in 20th century, because I think 90% of the buildings don't fall into any particular style, right? So it's never constructivist, no rationalist, no functionalist, it's something else. And then, of course, using this as a kind of matrix, right, we can think about what hasn't been built, right? And we can sort of come up with new ideas. So in a way, I'm now realizing just this summer, right, that generative capacity is interesting by itself, right? But we'll be able to generate things with algorithms, since late 60s. I want to remind us, right, that we wouldn't be here without Nicholas Negroponte, the founder of MIT Media Lab, and his first book was a 1970 book, Soft Architecture Machine, and he writes about the use of computers. So we had this for actually 50 years, and of course we can also use neural nets, we can use evolution algorithms, and so on. But I think what we don't have yet, right? So in fact, generative capacities, they're very beautiful, very powerful, right? But they're not yet tied up to the knowledge capacities. So now, right, imagine you have this kind of soft architecture machine 2.0, right? 2.0, which basically has this deep and broad knowledge of architecture, what was built, what is built in that city, what is built in this country, what was built on this planet for the last 5,000 years. And then it can start generating things, kind of using this as constraints and using this as a springboard. As opposed to now generating something, and then we select, we think that's interesting, but in fact, maybe the student who says that's interesting hasn't seen enough, and what she selects is something banal, right? So I think what I want to do, right, not just create data sets for machine learning and architecture, which I think is the first step, but kind of transfer, right, the whole knowledge of human architectural or material spatial creativity, right, everything which was built, and have a kind of, right, this kind of as a background for architecture AI. I mean, it's a radical proposal, right? It's a bit of a provocation, but I think you can take me on it, right? But yes, I mean, I hope my point. You see my point, right? But
I see your point.
Right? I mean, basically, we have a thing which can play in the sandbox, but doesn't have memory, right? Doesn't have a brain, right?
It's really funny that you touched exactly on what we're doing here in this workshop, which is the data set creation that allows you. I mean, the thing is, we were looking to create a data set that is profoundly diversified. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So meaning that it's not focusing on one specific culture, for example, right? Sure. Because we want to capture I don't want to say the essence of architecture. I think that's a little bit too much said. Yeah. But at least like basic features. Yeah. Let's say basic features that are globally present. And a workshop like this one here, Digital Futures, is ideal for that because you have a global audience of students sitting all over the world, who have their own cultural backgrounds, because also one of the things we were trying to handle is the aspect of bias in data sets. Like, how can we avoid that? If we take 5 students from the United States to do this data set, it will be skewed in a specific direction for sure. Yeah. So something like this touches on that, on exactly what you were saying, basically creating a large scale data set that globally captures architecture, and then hopefully understand how we can use that to generate architecture with it at the end.
Yeah. So I have like some new provocations to react. So first of all, I think that maybe again, like, right, I'm being very provocative, but just to stimulate the discussion, right? So here's the thing, right? So I remember I think 2 years ago or a year ago, I think it was a virtual event or maybe physical. So I was listening to the new head of AA, right, Architectural Association from London, who is very wonderful, very talented person. And she said, for the last few years, I've been running a studio. And what I do is I tell students, okay, study all the projects which got awards in Overtalk competitions and nothing else. And I was terrified, right? So, I think the best use of AI is we actually should educate AI, because many students don't get educated anymore because we have become with culture which has 5 minutes attention. So what I want to say is, it doesn't matter if you take 5 students, right, from AA or 5 students from SAYARC. We will actually we'll say great architecture. Okay, we'll be saying like Zaha Hadid building in Beijing, etc., right? So the architecture grades as opposed to what actually exists, right? etc. So in a way, you see what I'm saying. Like, yeah, I mean, people are here very diverse, and I will be very curious to see if this diversity actually gets mapped into the actual diversity of a data set, if everybody kind of picks out the same things, because this is the things which our culture considers to be important, right? Because architecture as the art, right, has become a very global field, and everybody looks at the same things, and everybody looks at this kind of winning projects. So perhaps, I think we have amazing technology, but when I see kind of many architectural projects being proposed for the future, I just want to go kill myself, because also I think within this paradigm, right, this kind of consumer, kind of bourgeois, let's have a safe, comfortable environment paradigm, very different from the 60s. I wish we had more advanced neural networks in 1968. These people would do something differently. And I think this kind of paradigm, on the one hand, you don't want to fail anymore, right? Everybody wants to be successful. But the only way to be successful is to do millions of experiments and to fail. The second thing is we're obsessed with security, comfort, and so on. So can we use AI to kind of get out from its limitations, or will we use AI to simply reinforce the current paradigm? So I think that's another interesting question.
Yeah, that's an important question, actually, because I don't think, by the way, that neural networks operate like the example you made from the AA, like you have a professor who tells students.
Neural network. Neural networks do not. But if this is directive AA, that's how she teaches his students, right?
Yeah, which is horrible. Sorry.
Right? Well, no. We don't want to say it, we respect her, but I'm just using this example. But I think, I'm looking at lots of academic courses online about digital media. We don't have any papers published before 2018, right? So that's a problem, right? Because you can use AI to make something amazing creative, or you can simply see what people are thinking in 1980 or 1970. It'll be even more creative.
No, I understand. I understand what you mean. I completely understand what you mean. But it's also the difference between making progress or making no progress and just repeating things that are around already. And the thing which I think is kind of sad is also when students are looking at projects, when they think they're like innovative and new and interesting and provoking and so on, most of the time for somebody who's really well informed, that's already done and gone, and we need to understand what's our current condition to work on architecture. Right. So there's also the information mismatch here that happens very often within the discipline. But I would like also to say that the one aspect that I'm really interested into, because it's not only about looking at the good and the best projects. Yeah, I think neural networks have also to learn what are the bad projects, because they need to differentiate between good and bad. Yeah, if they only see good projects, they'll never be able to differentiate whether a decision is good or bad.
Yeah, and then of course we come to the usual question: who decides, right, what's good and bad? I mean, are we looking at it from point of view of like world level architect, or are we looking at it from point of view of the people who actually live, right? From people who live in these cities of reinforced concrete ugliness. For them, anything else would be already good, right? But I want to maybe touch upon another thing: how do we represent architecture's data, right? Because this is, I published this book last fall, Cultural Analytics, which kind of summarizes like all the things I was thinking about for the last 13 years. And I think the key question is, how do we represent cultural phenomena as data, right? Because architecture is not only a three-dimensional model. It's not only photographs of facade, plan, and so on. It's a spatial experience. It's a temporal experience, right? It involves moving around. It involves point of view. And also, I think, what I also wonder, can computer ever understand architecture if computer doesn't have a body? I think our experience of architecture or space design, I mean, the reason I bring space design is I think it's much more successful field today with architecture. Korea has very boring buildings, but it has amazing cafes where every space inside is better than MoMA, right? So space design, small hotel lobbies and so on, right? Design hotels, design buildings. So that's, I think, the question which was already asked, right, in the early 70s. Can we really make intelligent computer? Can we completely represent knowledge as symbols, or is the fact that human knowledge, as we keep saying this means this, and this means, and eventually we we can't define things anymore because the human understands these meanings because it has a body, right? It's it's vertical, the earth is horizontal. And then as you're learning as a child, you're learning about mass, right, and texture and volume. And architects, of course, talk about it, right? Architects talk about volume, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I don't want to put us in a corner where we're just going to cry, but I want to ask, right, a very practical question. So, because since I started thinking about cultural analytics in 2007, I said, of course, I also want to work on architecture, but just as today, there was no architecture databases, maybe like real estate people have them, maybe cities have them, but even if we have them, it's a limited representation of this phenomenological spatial experience. So without having resources of Microsoft or Google and so on, what can we do, right? And even if we can't do it today, even if we could be sitting here digitizing 2D plans, we have to think about what we're doing is probably wrong. And one day we have to figure out something else. But how, right? So how do you do it, right? What is it? Let's say you have all resources in the world and you want to represent simple experience of one building. One, there could be the villa. Mm-hmm. What do you need to do? Do you need to have workforce? Do you need to have an agent, simulate the agent? Do you need to simulate all materials? The same questions can be asked. How do you simulate fashion, right? How do you simulate the experience of wearing piece of fashion, the dress, et cetera, et cetera? You can't simply calculate it from 2D photographs. Okay, I'll stop here. I mean, I think you got it, right? Yeah.
I understand. I completely understand, but that's, I think, also the reason why the architecture discipline came up with abstraction of space with the Albertian paradigm. No, I was just understanding how to capture space in a two-dimensional surface. by plane and section and so on, right? But I want to go somewhere else with this, because your comment about the amount of data present about architecture and the way how to capture then the non-quantifiable aspects of architecture, which is like emotion and walking through the spatial experience, atmospheric experience, light experience, and so on and so forth. Light might be possible.
Kinetic experience, right?
Exactly.
Also, you remember this idea from what was the guy, empathy, right? Where basically we like kind of like, we say, oh, this building has eyes, right? And all these architecture buildings have eyes, and then right, like the cathedral. So there's lots of this non-symbolic kind of non-geometric aspects.
But I think this is about to change, because if you think about it, the newest iPhone can capture space, right? So when you do a photograph, it also scans the space in 3D. All this data is getting collected now by Apple. So basically they're going to start to generate data sets of spaces, which are going to be enormous. And these are, of course, going to be used to, again, optimize promotion, optimize, like how to target specific people with specific messages and so on. So there's like this whole underbelly there. And I think I quoted you, by the way, the other day talking about the underbelly of the digital society, right? There, where there's like these massive amounts of neural networks and AIs at work, which we don't see on a day-to-day basis. We only see like this small sliver on the top of it. But if companies like Apple start collecting spaces, literally spaces,
which is true.
They will very, very quickly understand how to replicate, for example, or analyze the spatial experience and as you were saying, the temporal experience and all these sort of things, right?
Yeah,
and that's going to be interesting.
I mean, one thing I would say, if you're thinking about like which company, which industry, right, which application collects the most comprehensive representation of architecture, it's not real estate people. It's actually companies like Google and Yandex, right? Because we do with Street View, right? I mean, the Chinese also have Street View. The Russian search engine also have Street View, right? So we accumulated millions and millions of drive-throughs for millions and millions of roads. And what's interesting about it, right? It's actually, in a way, it's a better representation of architecture, because it's how like things actually are in the environment from a kind of like a anthropological point of view, right? Because of course, what happens also in a city is it's not one building. It's not only buildings. It's like always buildings, conglomeration, different styles. So that's very interesting, right? And what will happen, what you're saying, is that every person's phone will become equivalent, right? It will be collecting this 3D data.
Yeah. Lev, I don't want to take more time than I talked to you about away from you, but if possible, I would like to open maybe for 2 or 3 questions from the students. Is that okay?
Yeah, and also I would love to hear any. I mean, I don't want to take your time, but I would love to, because I'm so curious about this idea, right? What, like when people are going to bring all this data together, right? Are there some kind of like common, like how's the data going to talk to each other? And also just want to add one more thing, right? So on the one hand, I want to have a very diverse data set. On the other hand, if you give computer a very diverse data set, it's not going to learn anything, right? It will basically break down, right? So it's a kind of problem. If you look at the latest StyleGAN 2, right? Other StyleGAN 2, which I've been using, I'm kind of part of a very advanced data science lab here in Korea. And working with students with publishing papers, so I used the state-of-the-art StyleGAN 2, and it was fed I think 70,000 images from WikiArt, right, of 100 artists. And what I realized is that it's not able to make images in the style of any particular artist. It can make generic impressionism, it can make generic modernism, but it's very easy to make modernism. Because you don't have to get it right? You can just make some brush strokes, something that looks like a human figure, put some colors, right? So if you want to make some kind of Zaha Hadid, right, like kind of blobs, that's so easy. If you want to make like perfect classical architecture, classical order, that's very hard, right? So I think what I want to say is the issue of diversity, because I think one of the differences, the child is exposed to lots of things. Okay, maybe the child can't fly around and see buildings in different countries, but at least in her environment, she's exposed to lots of things, right? So what exactly do we do? How do we start, right? We want to be diverse, but we don't want to be completely diverse, because when the computer gets confused. So it's a partly technical question, right? Anyway, let's take some questions.
So if anyone has questions for Lev, now would be the moment.
If people are, I think, shy to talk, we have a wonderful thing called chat. So yes. you can also write something in the chat.
About your technical question of how to capture diversity, because I think that's a very fair question to ask. We created actually an automated interface to upload plans and annotate them, and we try to create the labels that are in that automated interface are hopefully diverse enough. Yeah.
Okay.
And also we avoided styles, by the way, because we figured out that we can say do a Gothic house, but what does this mean for a Chinese student? I mean, they have a different way of talking about time. It would be a dynasty, not Gothic style. Yeah.
Well, and so also very go ahead. Yeah. Well, I just want to add something because so for me, right, like I basically spent 13 years. We analyzed 43 data sets, more like image data sets, not architecture. Then I published a book. I wrote software, and to me, maybe the most interesting use of data science and AI for analysis is you don't have to use labels, right? Meaning you have to use labels for machine learning, which is a problem. But when we give computer millions of artifacts, right? Maybe it is pages of manga or modern paintings or architecture in the 20th century, you would realize that most things don't fit into a particular label, particular category. Most things are in between. Right? Think about 99% of 20th century painting. It's neo abstract or cubist, no, it is realism. It's somewhere in between. Right? And the same thing if you go to any European city, like Prague or most buildings, they actually don't fit into any classical architecture categories in the particular style, right? Because they're very, very eclectic. So I think one of the advantages of computers is that when you use unsupervised machine learning, which is what I like, right? You can represent this continuity. However, what do you do with insights if you want to teach computer? Because if you teach computer using supervised machine learning, you actually have to label data, which potentially already a very big problem, right?
Yeah,
so not having labels actually would be good, right? Not having labels actually would be good, because the labels given by cultural historians often are wrong or too simplistic, right?
I mean, the labeling process, of course, it's what opens up bias, and even if it's unintentional, by the way, it can happen unintentional, even that you bias something in a particular direction. This is, as I was saying, really a large-scale experiment that we're doing here in order to understand how to move ahead with neural networks in architecture in general.
Of course.
And also, of course, we're doing all of this public, so the data sets will be public for other architects to use in their neural networks. Yeah. And I'm curious about that possibility. Oh, there's a question.
We have to start somewhere, right?
Yeah,
so even if you would collect eventually after 6 months realize it was very simplistic, it's going to be useful as a way to start. Yes, there was a question about computational design in general. Well, so computational design, right? I mean, most of design now are probably computational because computational systems are used, right, to keep track of all the parts and materials, so-called beams, right? And when we're talking about parametricism, right? Well, so I think, here's what I think, right? And people don't know that I actually, before I migrated from Russia, I actually was a student in the architecture school, Moscow Architecture Institute, which is located in the same building, which had Futimas, which I only found out a couple of years ago myself. So, I'm kind of like an architect who, like many architects, escape, right, from a profession. Well, actually, I never wanted to. Anyway, but when, because of this, I went into 3D computer animation, it took me. So here's what I want, right? Here's what I would say. So as I travel around the world, like in 1990, I traveled 13 months nonstop, and I lived, not just traveled, I lived in 27 cities, 18 countries. And what I do, I basically research this planet. That's what I do, right? And here's what I think, right? So you have this super architects, but now it can be also done by students. So I think Zaha became, right, like a kind of representative of his early movement and Patrick, etc. But now many other people do it or don't do it, and with amazing, beautiful things. And sometimes when you actually come to a building, it's beautiful. Like, for example, in Seoul, with this amazing, design plaza built. It's beautiful, except it has zero connection to the environment, right? It doesn't learn from Seoul. It was never trying to. And also, it's sometimes beautiful, right, as a 3D rendering, as a kind of Photoshop image, but it doesn't really work, right, on a kind of like human scale, right? And when you have millions of architects, who are building little buildings, millions of cafe houses in Korea. In Korea, like a coffee place can be 5 stories. It's architectural masterpiece, right? So we're building these things, and we're thinking about every texture, right? Like I'm here in this hotel room, kind of built by the guy who is not a professional architect. He's using 7 different kinds of wood. And ultimately, right? So I think there are these 2 different paradigms: people who actually kind of craftspeople, who think about human scale, and who build in a very modest way, but in a deeply human way. But when they say, yeah, but it's not so interesting, and then there are, Zaha and everybody else, right, who makes this amazing kind of parametric monsters, but doesn't really know, right, has no idea how to bring this kind of texture, this kind of skill, right, into their buildings. I mean, I think, in fact, when I think about the top 10 modern architects, the only people who I think about texture and surface is Fertig de Maron, right? Gary doesn't think about it. I'm talking about all the generations, right? So the question is, I think both things are wonderful on their own, but so far we haven't connected, right? Because, I want to be in some like amazing buildings like this, but I also want to have, all these different textures. Like, for example, the walls, you use the same panels as a bathroom, and just symbolically it creates this amazing, amazing feeling, right? Both kind of experientially and symbolically, right? And so how do we bring these different levels together, right? So I think it's a kind of challenge for architecture in general, and also challenge for computational design, because I think with parametrism, right, as it developed out of Zaha, it's not really about texture, right? It's not really about feeling. It's really about kind of this basically geometric form. But I think in the last 10 years, right, we kind of moved away from this minimal, very cold, white and white minimalism, right? And if you look at the contemporary real architecture, what people actually build in hotels, restaurants, and so on, it's lots of textures, lots of materials, right? Wood and metal and so on. So people kind of want this minimal, but very warm, right? Very warm, kind of very rich, right? Nature-like minimalism. And how does parametrism fit into it? I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. I think that only will increase because, and even more after the pandemic, because people are really lusting for tactile experience.
Exactly. Exactly. Like I was in some cafe in Seoul, just very basic box. But I counted, we used 13 different materials, right? Like 4 different types of reinforced concrete and 5 woods. And basically, I was so happy there, right? It's like I was in paradise, because I think, we humans kind of connect to these textures and factura on a very deep level. And of course, even modernism, right, said, okay, now we're going to make these buildings have no details, no kind of dimensional relief. It's a deeply anti-human architecture, And now we live in these kind of buildings, which are kind of, in addition to being human, we're also badly done from bad materials, right? And they keep decaying. Yeah. So I hope with this kind of, so how can AI kind of bring us into this new texture paradise? That's an interesting question.
That's an interesting one. I think Alexa had a comment.
Please. Okay.
No, I guess this was relating more back to kind of the discussion before this last question about the simplicity and kind of potential erroneous nature of labeling. And I think one of the really interesting things that has come out of recent advances in content generation, particularly with like the DALL-E model from OpenAI, is that I think that captions are now serving as a really interesting opportunity for supervised machine learning in design. With captions, we can kind of capture a lot more information related to particular styles, for example, whereas, the term Baroque might be like way too overly simplistic, but if we're able to describe subsets of building features through captions that might end up classifying as Baroque, it might provide a much better supervisory signal to these learning algorithms. Yeah. And so with our data sets, in particular, this 3D data set that we're trying to create, we're actually capturing, in addition to just kind of more binary labels, we're also, we're collecting captions of, descriptions from architects of what, what makes these houses unique.
Basically, and also what adjectives do we use, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you for, also your contribution. So, I'm kind of thinking about writing your paper, because always reflection about, categories, right, and fuzzy categories, and right, etc. So it led me to the idea. I said, what are the different models we can use to think about kind of like cultural entities? So one idea, we have a category, right? So something belongs to category or not. But today we also have like prototype. We also have like a kind of prototypes. So we have templates, right? So you design something in WordPress, you get a template. So template is another mechanism in how contemporary culture works. Another one is layering, right? People put layers, what used to be called remix. So there is basically 5 or 6 very general kind of creative operations today. Often we don't create categories, right? Because I think what's interesting with categories, common architectural kind of, right, debates or cultural debates in the 19th century. 19th century was century of categories. For the last 40 years, we live in a society of remix, right? And in fact, our whole culture for the last 40 years, and probably for another 20 years at least, is drawing its energy from confusing categories, right? Challenging categories. And suddenly comes machine learning, and we are back in the 19th century, right? So one thing we have to do as a cultural people, completely question, right, this idea of using single labels, because this is just very regressive. You can do it as long as you know what you're doing something wrong, right? So I think using adjectives, et cetera, right? And another thing is, are you labeling the whole building? Because you can start labeling, right, or creating database of particular parts, and then you don't have to have a concept of style, right? You can have like Wittgenstein idea family resemblance, right? So you can have, if you have like 4 or 5 of these elements, you get one thing. If you get other elements, you get another thing, right? So this idea that you can put things in the categories, that's idea from Aristotle, right, 2,000 years ago. In the 1970s, cognitive psychologists such as Roche and later Lakoff, basically proved that's not how human beings think, right? We don't think in this kind of Aristotelian categories. We think in the fuzzy categories. Anyway, sorry, you got me started. I've been thinking about it for the last 14 years. So I'll better be quiet. Yeah.
Absolutely not. That's why you're here, Lev. So thank you very much. I think I have a last question here from Navid Ansari in the chat. As I understand, usually new tools and technologies do the tasks faster and better. In result of that, the old tools don't become obsolete, and interestingly, their semantic value increase. Could it be the case for AI's art and humans' art? Is it possible that we discover something novel in our creativity in the near future?
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely correct, right, Navid? So, for example, like in the last 5 to 10 years, there was more and more interest, both among amateurs and professionals, in analog photography, right? Actually, in the 60s was another wave of interest in the 19th century photographic processes, camera obscures, and so on, right? And I think it happens, right, because people do realize that it's all the technologies, we activate different ways of thinking, right? Different ways of tactile thinking, different ways of spatial thinking, right? If I'm editing a film using Maviola, right? If I'm cutting film, it's a very different process from editing it in Premiere. And you guys architects, so you know it, right? Like I remember 20 years ago, I went for the first time inside Sayar in LA, and I was shocked, right? Because every project presentation, you have 3D models, right? You have drawings, you have 3D things, you have textures, right? So every project was using 5 to 10 different modalities, because every modality not only allows you to represent something differently, it allows you to think differently. right? And that's why I think, both architecture students or your future children, right? If there's only a computer in front of you, this is terrifying, right? Because you don't use all the different kind of modalities, all the different types of thinking, which we humans have, right? And that's why we develop tools, variety of tools, handles, and so on, right? In fact, I'm thinking with the screen, this interface we have now, it's just a stage. I'm convinced with 15 to 20 years from now, we will preserve all the good things about digital and network, but we'll have some kind of tactile interfaces, more physical interfaces, maybe more 3D things. I'm sure the screen will go away because it's just wrong, right? Because it's so limiting. So definitely. In fact, if you don't use AI, you're probably going to be much more interesting because you can be more creative today because people don't use AI today, right? We use a particular methods which got popular in the last 5 years, right? We don't even use AI as it was 20 years ago. So, yeah. And 5 years from now, these methods people will laugh at these methods, right? So the more you can learn about history of AI, but also history of human culture, right? Why Lev Manovich is Lev Manovich? Because I look at the 18th, 19th, and the 20th century, and I can connect it to a computer, right? It's kind of my brand, right? And other people only look at what's happening today. So that's kind of right. So you don't need AI to discover human creativity. You just have to go read Wikipedia. That's already a good start, about kind of human cultural history. Yeah.
Lev, thank you so much for joining us today. This was absolutely amazing. Great conversation. I would love to keep going. I have a lot of more questions now. Maybe another time we can catch up on that.
The best thing because I was getting the emails. I kind of was going to set up alarm for tomorrow 10 a.m. And luckily, like I'm on my iPad, like watching some idiotic YouTube in bed actually. And then luckily I have notification. Your email arrives. So I jump, put my pants on, and I'm here. And so if you didn't email me, I'm really sorry because, and I want to say like this, right? I do say things which sound controversial or radical, but this is only to explore ideas, right? We're only to explore ideas, and the more ideas we have, the better, right? Ultimately, what do you want to create AI? You want AI to give us lots of choices and to show how what we normally do potentially very limiting. Okay, you design something amazing, so AI can look at this, compare it to millions of designers, 67% of architecture students design exactly the same thing today, right? So that's kind of what I think AI should do, right? AI should point out that we're not creative and very repetitive, and then help us grow as creative artists and architects. So think of me as your nasty Russian AI with Russian accent, who is basically just here, right? Who've been trained, and I've been programmed to question everything around me, and that seems to work for me. So I want to invite you to do the same.
Awesome.
Thank you, Matias. Thanks.
Thank you, Lev. Great.
Ciao.
It was good to have you here.
Thank you.
Talk soon.